Henry Carter was the man who had it all, or so the world believed. At 42, his name was synonymous with power and prestige, his wealth vast enough to make any problem disappear. But as he sat in his sprawling penthouse, surrounded by cold marble and the hum of silence, he realized there was one thing his riches couldn't buy: an heir. His 2 failed marriages had taught him one thing: love was a liability, a distraction he couldn't afford. But a child? A child was different. A child was a legacy, an extension of himself that would carry on his empire. He didn't want love or a family in the traditional sense. He wanted control, a clean arrangement with no messy emotions. That night, as the city buzzed below, Henry made a decision. He would find someone willing to bear his child, a transaction, nothing more. He wanted no strings, no drama, just a clear agreement. With his resources, he knew he could make it happen. What he didn't know was how that decision would set in motion events that would change his life forever. The following morning, Henry slid behind the wheel of his sleek sports car, his mind preoccupied. His lawyers had drawn up a watertight contract, and now he needed the right candidate. As he navigated the busy streets, something caught his eye: a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, sketching furiously on a scrap of dirty paper. Her tangled brown hair shielded her face, but her hands moved with precision. There was something raw about her, an intensity that stood out against the chaos of the city. She seemed invisible to everyone else, but Henry couldn't look away. When the light turned green, he drove on, but the image of her lingered. A few blocks later, he pulled into a parking lot and sat there, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. But a nagging feeling gnawed at him, and before he could stop himself, he turned the car around. The woman was still there, leaning her paper against the wall, oblivious to the world. Henry pulled up to the curb and rolled down the window. "Hey, you," he called, his tone sharp. "Come here." The woman glanced up, her piercing blue eyes meeting his with suspicion. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Get in the car," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I don't have all day," she scoffed, folding her arms. "I'm not for sale, if that's what you're thinking." Henry's jaw tightened. "Don't be absurd. I'm offering you an opportunity. Now, are you coming, or should I drive off and forget I saw you?" She hesitated, her gaze darting between him and the life she was desperate to escape. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she stood and opened the car door. The silence in the car was heavy as they drove through the city. Henry didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the road. The woman, however, couldn't suppress her unease. "So, are you going to tell me where we're going, or is this some kind of kidnapping?" she asked, her sarcasm barely masking her fear. "A cafe," Henry replied curtly. "Somewhere quiet where we can talk." When they arrived, Henry led her to a corner table, his movements calculated and efficient. He ordered coffee for himself and water for her. "What's your name?" he asked, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Leah Parker," she said, crossing her arms. "And you?" "Henry Carter. I'm here to make you an offer that could change your life." Leah raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "I'm listening." "I want you to have my child." His words were blunt, devoid of any preamble. Leah blinked, her breath catching. "Excuse me?" "It's a straightforward arrangement," Henry continued. "I'll cover all your expenses, provide you with everything you need during the pregnancy, and pay you a significant amount afterward. In return, you'll have no claim to the child, no strings attached." For a moment, Leah was too stunned to respond. Then she laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "You're serious? Who does that? Who just walks up to a stranger and says, 'Hey, have my baby'?" "The kind of man who knows what he wants," Henry replied, leaning forward. "You're in no position to refuse. I'm offering you a way out of this life. Stability, comfort, a fresh start." Leah's fists clenched under the table. She hated his arrogance, his confidence that she would comply. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had nothing. No family, no home, no future. Still, The idea of selling herself, even for a chance at escape, made her stomach churn. "And if I say no?" she challenged. Henry leaned back, his expression cold. "Then you go back to the street. The choice is yours." Leah stared at him, her mind racing. She knew she was at a crossroads. But could she make such a deal and still live with herself? Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I need time to think." "You have 24 hours, Henry said, standing abruptly. "After that, the offer's off the table." Leah watched him leave, feeling as though her entire world had just shifted. For better or worse, she wasn't sure. Leah wandered the streets that night, her thoughts racing. Henry's words echoed in her mind. Stability, comfort, a fresh start. But the idea of carrying a child for a man she'd just met, someone so cold and calculating, made her feel like she was losing herself before she'd even started. She found a bench in a quiet park and sat down, hugging her knees against the night chill. Memories flooded her mind. Her life before she ended up on the streets, the dreams she once had of being an artist, and the relentless spiral that led her here. Her mother's voice whispered in her head, an old lesson from her childhood. Opportunities don't come twice, Leah. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. But was this an opportunity or a trap? By dawn, Leah had made her decision. She would go back. Not because she trusted Henry, but because she couldn't face another night of hunger and uncertainty. Whatever lay ahead, it couldn't be worse than this. When Leah walked into Henry's office the next morning, his piercing gaze locked onto her. She stood in the doorway, her shoulders squared but her nerves fraying at the edges. "I've decided," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I'll do it." Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let's make this official." He gestured to a folder on the desk. "The contract has been prepared. My lawyers ensured it's fair and binding. You'll have everything you need, but once the child is born, your involvement ends. No contact, no claims." Leah hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. "And what happens to me after?" "You'll have financial security," Henry replied. "Enough to rebuild your life, start fresh. You'll never have to worry again." The contract felt heavier than it should as she held it in her hands. Leah scanned the pages, the legal language blurring together. She knew this was a moment that would define her life, but she also knew she had no other choice. She picked up the pen and signed. Leah's life changed overnight. That same day she was escorted to Henry's mansion, a sprawling estate that seemed to belong to another world. The grand iron gates opened to reveal manicured gardens and a marble facade that gleamed in the sunlight. It was the kind of place she'd only seen in magazines, and now it was her home. Stephanie, Henry's efficient and cheerful assistant, greeted her at the door. "Welcome, Miss Parker. Let me show you to your room." Leah followed her through the mansion, overwhelmed by the opulence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and the air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood. She felt out of place, like a stray cat wandering into a palace. "This will be your suite," Stephanie said, opening a set of double doors to reveal a room larger than any apartment Leah had ever lived in. The bed was massive, covered in soft linens, and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens. Leah stood in the doorway, hesitant to step inside. "This is a lot," she said. Stephanie smiled. "You'll get used to it. If you need anything, just call me. My job is to make sure you're comfortable." Leah nodded, but the truth was, comfort felt like a foreign concept. That night, as she lay in the oversized bed, she stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her decision more acutely than ever. She was here because she'd signed away 9 months of her life, and possibly her soul. The days passed in a blur of appointments and routines. Doctors came and went, running tests to ensure Leah's health. Meals were served promptly, each dish more extravagant than the last. But despite the luxury, Leah felt isolated. The mansion was vast, and Henry rarely appeared. One afternoon, Leah finally saw him in the hallway. He was impeccably dressed, his movements purposeful as always. "Henry!" she called out before she could stop herself. He turned, his expression as cool as ever. "Leah, is everything all right? I just haven't seen you around," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "I wasn't sure if I'd even recognize you if we crossed paths." Henry's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "I've been busy, but I trust everything is being taken care of." "It is," she admitted, though the words felt strange. "I guess I just didn't expect this distance." His gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. "This isn't personal, Leah. It's a business arrangement. As long as you're well, there's no need for me to hover." Leah bit her lip, nodding. "Right, of course." But as the weeks went on, something shifted. Leah noticed small gestures that hinted at a different side of Henry. One morning, she found a new set of art supplies left outside her door, a sketchbook and pencils of the highest quality. She hadn't mentioned her love of drawing since their first conversation, but somehow he'd remembered. When she saw him later that day, she stopped him in the library. "Was this from you?" she asked, holding up the sketchbook. He nodded, barely glancing up from the papers he was reading. "I thought it might help you pass the time." Leah frowned, unsure how to respond. "Thank you. That was thoughtful." Henry didn't reply, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that surprised her. One night, unable to sleep, Leah wandered out to the garden. The moonlight cast a silvery glow over the flowers, and the air was cool and still. She sat on a stone bench, her thoughts heavy. "Can't sleep?" Henry's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "Not really," she admitted. "This place, it's beautiful, but it doesn't feel real." Henry walked closer, his expression contemplative. "It isn't meant to feel real. It's meant to be controlled, predictable." Leah tilted her head, studying him. "Is that how you live? Controlling everything so nothing can surprise you?" "Yes," he said simply. "Surprises lead to mistakes." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You can't control everything, Henry. Life doesn't work that way." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe not, but it's worked for me so far." Leah looked at him, a mixture of frustration and curiosity bubbling within her. "Maybe it's time to try something different." Henry met her eyes, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he might argue, but instead he nodded, just once, before walking back inside, leaving her alone with her thoughts. For the first time since she'd arrived, Leah felt a spark of something she hadn't expected. Hope. Weeks turned into months, and Leah began to settle into a routine, though unease lingered beneath the surface. The mansion's walls felt both protective and suffocating. She distracted herself with the sketchbook Henry had given her, pouring emotions into drawings she wasn't ready to voice. One day, Stephanie informed her that Henry would accompany her to her next medical appointment. The news surprised Leah. Henry had kept his distance, and she assumed he preferred to remain detached. When the day arrived, his presence in the car was a quiet but commanding one. He didn't say much, but his occasional glances toward her revealed a tension he couldn't quite mask. At the clinic, the doctor's cheerful demeanor contrasted with the charged atmosphere between Leah and Henry. As the ultrasound machine buzzed to life, Leah lay back, clutching the edge of the examination table. Henry stood nearby, his posture stiff. "Let's see how everything's progressing," the doctor said, adjusting the monitor. The first sound was faint but unmistakable, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. Leah felt a lump in her throat, overwhelmed by the simple yet profound sound. She glanced at Henry, whose stoic expression faltered for the briefest moment. Then the doctor's brow furrowed and he adjusted the equipment. "Well now, that's interesting." Leah's heart raced. "What is it? Is something wrong?" The doctor smiled, pointing to the screen. "Not at all. You're having twins." Leia's eyes widened, her breath catching. Twins? She turned to Henry, whose face betrayed a flicker of surprise, a rare crack in his carefully maintained armor. Yes, the doctor confirmed, his voice warm. 2 healthy babies. The room fell silent save for the sound of the heartbeats. Leah couldn't take her eyes off the screen, the 2 tiny lives flickering in black and white. She felt an unexpected wave of connection, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. As they left the clinic, the air between them was charged with something unspoken. In the car, Henry finally broke the silence. Twins. That changes things. For you, maybe, Leah replied, her voice trembling. For me, it just makes this harder. Henry glanced at her, but she kept her gaze fixed out the window. His voice softened, a rarity for him. We'll make sure everything is handled properly. Leah didn't respond. She wasn't sure if his words were meant to reassure her or to convince himself. The pregnancy progressed quickly, and the news of the twins added a new layer of complexity. The mansion buzzed with quiet preparations. A nursery was expanded, and more staff were hired. Leah noticed Henry's increased involvement, though he maintained his calculated demeanor. But as the due date approached, Leia's emotions became harder to suppress. She spent more nights on the balcony, staring at the stars, her thoughts swirling with doubts and fears. Could she truly give these babies away? Could she walk away from something that already felt like a part of her soul? Then, one cold evening, the first contractions hit. The pain was sharp and sudden, leaving her clutching the edge of her bed. Stephanie rushed to her side, helping her to the car as Henry appeared, his usual composed demeanor replaced by visible concern. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically urgent. Leah nodded, biting back a groan. It's happening. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Henry sat beside her, his hand hovering near hers but never quite touching. "You're going to be fine," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed his own nerves. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Leah was wheeled into the delivery room, and Henry surprised her by refusing to leave. "I'm staying," he insisted, his tone brooking no argument. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion, but Leah fought through it, her determination fueled by the tiny lives she was about to bring into the world. Henry stood by her side, his hand gripping hers as if anchoring her to the moment. Finally, a piercing cry filled the room, followed by another. "A boy and a girl," the doctor announced, his voice filled with warmth. "Both healthy." Leia's tears flowed freely as the babies were placed in her arms. They were so small, so perfect. Her heart swelled with a love she hadn't anticipated, and the weight of what she had agreed to do crushed her. Henry stood nearby, his expression unreadable as he looked at the babies. Then, almost hesitantly, he reached out, taking the boy into his arms. For the first time, Leah saw something shift in him, an unguarded tenderness that made her chest ache. "They're beautiful," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Leah nodded, her voice a whisper. "They're ours." Later that night, Henry sat in the hospital nursery, watching the twins through the glass. Stephanie brought him a coffee, but he barely touched it. His thoughts were a storm, emotions he couldn't name churning beneath his carefully constructed facade. When Leah woke in her room, the first thing she saw was Henry standing by the door, both babies in his arms. He walked over, his movements cautious, as if the weight of the moment might shatter him. "You should rest," he said, placing the boy in her arms. But his eyes stayed on hers, and for once they weren't cold. They were filled with something Leah couldn't quite place: gratitude, vulnerability, and something dangerously close to affection. She cradled the baby, her tears falling silently. "I don't know how to let them go." Henry sat beside her, the girl still in his arms. "Maybe you don't have to." Leah looked up, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" He hesitated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I don't know. But this changes everything." For the first time, Leah saw the walls around Henry begin to crumble. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something more. The days following the twins' birth were both a blessing and a curse for Leah. Each moment she spent with them, their tiny fingers wrapping around hers, their innocent cries, drew her deeper into a love she couldn't contain. But that love came with a price. The contract loomed over her like a shadow, a constant reminder of the life she had agreed to leave behind. Henry, too, was different. He spent more time at home, his presence in the nursery growing increasingly frequent. He wasn't just observing, he was learning. From feeding bottles to gently rocking the twins to sleep, his once clinical demeanor was replaced with something raw and unexpected: fatherhood. One evening, as Leah sat in the nursery holding her daughter, Henry walked in. He stood silently for a moment, watching the scene unfold. Finally he spoke, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Leah looked up, her heart sinking. She knew this moment was coming. "About the contract," she said quietly. Henry nodded and pulled a chair closer. "I wrote that contract because I thought it was the only way to get what I wanted. No complications, no mess. But now, things aren't as simple as I imagined." Leah's grip on the baby tightened. "They're not just your children, Henry. They're ours. And giving them up, I don't know if I can do it." He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're not alone in that. I've been thinking about what this all means, what they mean, and what you mean." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. Henry continued, his voice softer now. "I thought I could control everything, but I've realized control doesn't matter when it comes to them, or to you. The contract doesn't mean anything anymore." Leah blinked, disbelief flickering across her face. "What are you saying, Henry?" He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave. I don't want you to walk out of their lives. Or mine." Leah's world spun as she processed Henry's words. She had prepared herself for the heartbreak of leaving, convinced it was inevitable. But now, the man who had once treated her like a business arrangement was offering her something she hadn't dared to hope for. "Henry," she began, her voice trembling, "you can't just tear up a contract and expect everything to change. How do I know this isn't just another plan?" He turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically open. "Because this isn't about a plan. It's about what I feel. For the first time in my life, I want more than just an heir. I want a family." Tears welled in Leah's eyes, but she shook her head. "I've spent my whole life being let down, Henry. How do I trust that this is real?" "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said, stepping closer. "But I'm willing to prove it. To you. To them." He glanced at the twins, who were now sleeping peacefully. "You've shown me that some things are worth risking everything for." Leah looked down at her daughter, her heart warring with her mind. She wanted to believe him, but the pain of her past made her hesitate. "This is more than just about us, Henry. It's about what's best for them." "I know," he replied, his voice resolute. "And I believe what's best for them is having both of us. Together." The sincerity in his tone broke down the last of her defenses. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Okay," she whispered. "But if we're going to do this, it has to be real. No more walls. No more control." Henry smiled faintly, his eyes shining with relief. "Agreed." The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. Henry and Leah worked together to create a life that felt genuine, not perfect, but full of effort and care. The twins became the center of their world, their tiny milestones bringing moments of joy neither Henry nor Leah had anticipated. One evening, Henry surprised Leah with a small gathering in the mansion's garden. The space was decorated with soft lights and fresh flowers, a serene backdrop for an intimate celebration. "What's all this?" Leah asked as she stepped outside, cradling the twins. Henry, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, walked up to her with a hint of nervousness. "This is a new beginning," he said simply. For us. Leah's heart raced as he took her free hand. I want us to be more than co-parents, more than just two people bound by circumstance. I want us to be a family, Leah, and I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul. Leah's tears returned, but this time they were tears of hope. I've never had a family before, she admitted, but I think I'm ready to try. Henry smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. Then let's try. Together. In the months that followed, the mansion transformed from a cold, sterile space into a warm, welcoming home. Henry learned to laugh again, his once icy demeanor thawed by the chaos and joy of raising twins. Leah rediscovered her passion for art, her sketches now filled with vibrant scenes of her new life. One sunny afternoon, as the twins played on a blanket in the garden, Leah looked over at Henry. He was lying on the grass, his daughter perched on his chest as he pretended to fly her like an airplane. His laughter rang out, genuine and unrestrained. Leah smiled, a deep sense of contentment washing over her. She had once thought she was just a part of a transaction, a means to an end. But now she realized she was something much more, a mother, a partner, and finally, someone who belonged. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice breaking the serene moment. Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, "and it's all because of you." As they sat together, watching their children, Leah knew that while their journey had been far from conventional, it had led them exactly where they were meant to be. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the garden as Leah cradled one of the twins in her arms. Henry sat beside her, their other child sleeping soundly against his chest. The soft breeze carried with it a peace neither of them had thought possible. Leah broke the silence. "You know, I used to think happiness wasn't meant for someone like me." Henry glanced at her, his gaze soft yet resolute. "And I used to think love was a weakness. But you proved me wrong." She smiled, her fingers gently tracing the baby's tiny hand. "Maybe we proved each other wrong." Henry nodded, his free hand reaching to cover hers. "This isn't just about what we've gained. It's about who we've become. Together." The sound of the twins stirring brought a quiet chuckle from Henry. "Looks like they agree." Leah laughed softly, her heart full. "They're the best thing that's ever happened to us." Henry leaned closer, his voice low and sincere. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." As they sat there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of their home, they knew their journey wasn't just about creating a family. It was about finding themselves and each other in the process. It was messy, imperfect, and more beautiful than they could have imagined. Thank you for watching this heartfelt journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories like this. Together, we can bring more warmth and inspiration to the world. Here's wishing you love, happiness, and endless possibilities. Stay tuned and have an amazing day.